All right, today we're going to talk about the Haitian Revolution, which gets going in about 1789 as a direct result of the French Revolution, which we kind of left off with last time. The Haitian Revolution is one of the giant events in all of world history because it's one of the first and most successful slave-based uprisings that would overthrow a colonial government, or really any government, and kick out the former slave owners and build a fully independent country out of the former slaves. So this is a big one that, quite honestly, textbooks and documentaries should talk about quite a lot more because it's a giant change in all of world history, this kind of mass violent uprising against slavery, but often is very much overlooked in official sources. So a lot of students may have never even heard of the Haitian Revolution before we get going with this today. So we'll start off talking about the background of the island where the revolution would happen and would eventually become renamed Haiti. Before the revolution, the island was called Saint-Domingue because it was a French colony on the island of Hispaniola. So, just real quickly, we'll just go right down to the slide. So Saint-Domingue was a French colony in the 1700s. It was on the island of Hispaniola, which was the first island that we believe the Spanish, with Columbus, had arrived to very early, 1492. That's the island where they landed. And so this was the first attempt at colonization in the New World by the Iberians. But the French had basically taken over the western part of the island many, many years before. And so the French had basically colonized the western part and started growing sugarcane in massive quantities on the western part of the island. The eastern part of the island was still called Saint-Domingue, which was still a Spanish colony until the 1790s. So when the Haitian Revolution gets going in 1789, the island is still split in half between the French in the west half and the Spanish ownership over the eastern half, or the eastern two-thirds, basically. But Saint-Domingue, despite its fairly small size on this map compared to the rest of France and the overall French Empire, Saint-Domingue is a fairly small territory, but it's hugely important because it produces so much wealth from all the sugar that is being grown. So Saint-Domingue was estimated to be about the value of all 1/3 of all French exports across the whole world. So Saint-Domingue is extremely valuable when you measure the kind of value of exports in money, basically on a yearly basis. And Saint-Domingue's economy, its exports, were more valuable than all of the entire United States in the 1780s. So this is a kind of massively profitable island, probably the most profitable colony, not just in the Caribbean, but possibly across the whole world, given its size. So France could not even absorb all the export, especially sugar, that the island was producing. So the island's exports would not just go to France, but they would be sold virtually all over the European world, from Scandinavia all the way out to the Middle East. So their export has worldwide importance, and therefore the island has worldwide importance as an economic hub. And so Saint-Domingue is very different from a lot of other colonies that we've talked about throughout this course. It's extremely wealthy, and that wealth will kind of trickle down into a lot of different ways. They will build large European-style cities on the coastline of Saint-Domingue, which would become kind of opulent and elegant and all kinds of things, which would be very different from other major cities we see in the rest of Latin America. And Saint-Domingue would be the largest single market for the Atlantic slave trade. So the population of the island is the vast majority are slaves. So this is a closer map of what the island looks like by 1789. So you see Saint-Domingue, the French-occupied western part of the island, is really fairly small. It's only about 25% of or so of the entire island's territory. So, I mean, you see the island is fairly small compared to other colonies throughout Latin America, and you consider that Saint-Domingue is only about the western third or western quarter of the island. Its productivity and its wealth is very, very extreme for its size. And that's largely because of the sugar cane. Sugar prices are booming in the late 1700s. And the mass population of the island are enslaved. They are the slaves that are out working in the sugar plantations, basically. So the total population of the western part of the island, Saint-Domingue, the French colony, is somewhere around 550,000 people. And about 500,000 of them are slaves. So only somewhere around 50,000 and change are some type of free non-slave workforce, basically. So about 90%, 90, of the island's population, the French colony's population, are slaves. About 32,000 European colonists live in the colony, and about 24,000 free mulattoes. So mixed race people that are not enslaved, they also live in the island, and especially the mulattoes will become extremely important as the revolution will start to develop. So what made Saint-Domingue pretty unusual is that its society had such a large amount of free mulattoes that are not enslaved and are actually fairly wealthy, because many of them have bought land, so they might have their own farm or perhaps a sugar plantation, and the free mulattoes actually own slaves themselves. So there is a fairly large and fairly wealthy mulatto section of their economy, of their society, which was very different from a lot of the other Latin American colonies that we've talked about before. And those mulattoes, they are growing in wealth, and over time they'll start to demand basically equal rights with the European white colonists, which becomes the kind of big point of contention early on that gets the kind of revolutionary movement started. And these mulattoes are often called the gens de couleur, which means basically the colored people. But you have to remember, these colored people are the free ones that own slaves very often, and they're making money. But they're very heavily discriminated against within the colony's kind of social structure, social status, and even their legal status. They're not allowed into certain places, and they cannot hold certain offices and whatnot. So the white Europeans are trying to hold on to power as much as they possibly can in the colony, even though there's this rising and fairly large population of free mulattoes that are demanding increasingly more rights and privileges for themselves. So that's a kind of background going into the big year 1789, and that's a big year we have to remember because the Estates General is meeting in France in 1789 in the spring to start talking about how to advise the king to reform the tax code to basically pull France out of major financial crises. And that leads to the overall French Revolution that we talked about a little bit last time. So the Estates General recognizes Saint-Domingue's importance, but economic importance at least, but did not invite any kind of political colonial representatives. They didn't invite any contingent of politicians from the colony to go to France to participate in the Estates General, but Saint-Domingue sent some of their own representatives anyway, kind of unofficially. So there are both white representatives, and there are also some that are the gens de couleur, and they want two very different things from the Estates General. So when they show up in France, the white colonists start asking the formal French government for what they call more home rule, which means that the white colonists that are running the colony want more power to oversee their own development and mess around with their own tax rates and whatnot. They will still be under the authority of the French king in a French colony, but the colonists basically want more power to kind of run their own colony themselves instead of waiting for orders from France. So that's what the white Europeans are asking for at the Estates General. The gens de couleur want the end of discrimination against them. So the gens de couleur want kind of full equality with the white colonists, and they're asking the Estates General to pass a law or sign some kind of decree forcing that through. But we have to remember that the gens de couleur, they do not want full equality for all people of African descent in the colony. They do not want that equality because the gens de couleur themselves own slaves. So they are very afraid that if they start asking for real equality, then that kind of debate can eventually end up in a place where the French government will just end all slavery in the colony. And the gens de couleur do not want that because they're making a lot of money off of owning slaves. So the gens de couleur, their big leader is named Vincent Auger. So he leads the gens de couleur delegation at the National Assembly, and he kept pushing the Assembly as it becomes the National Assembly and starts writing a French Constitution over the summer. He keeps pushing them to take some kind of official stance on race and discrimination, and possibly even a stance on ending slavery. So the French leaders, they'll debate these ideas every once in a while, but the whole debate makes most of the French politicians very uncomfortable. They do not want to take a big stand on slavery. They really feel that they have kind of bigger problems to solve related to the king and democracy and writing a constitution and things like that. So the Assembly will often tell people like Auger, yeah, you just have to be patient, we'll get to it eventually. But the Assembly mostly just kind of defers and keeps putting off that debate. And they're really mostly trying to avoid that debate as much as they can, even though outwardly they say, yes, we believe in equality and whatnot, because that's what the French Revolution is supposed to be about. But they keep on avoiding the debate month after month after month, which really outrages Auger and others, and they decide to start taking other actions. So one big action the next spring is that the white colonial assembly in Saint-Domingue itself, they have their own assembly that meets in the town of Saint-Marc, which is this green dot on the map here. And that assembly officially declared itself the sovereign governing body over the island, over the colony. So this assembly says that they're going to be the official lawmaking power of the colony. And they say that they're still under the authority of the French king back in France, but this is an attempt to make themselves into like the official elected body that's going to make laws and enforce laws in the colony itself. So the colonists, they actually pay fairly low tax rates. So their big thing that they're trying to accomplish in declaring themselves sovereign is to basically run the colony on a much more local level instead of waiting for orders from France, because they're afraid that some very corrupt officials are advising the king on what to do about the colony. So their real goal is to rule themselves for the most part, because they say we've been running the place so well for a while now that we know what we're doing. But again, these European white politicians in the colony, they're mostly looking to keep power for themselves. They don't even want to include the so-called kind of European white middle class in the colonies. These politicians are big landowners. They generally own the giant sugar plantations, so they're very wealthy. And they don't even want to include other European colonists that are, small shopkeepers or artisans or something like that. So this is a very, very elitist movement amongst the European white landowners in the colony. And at the same time, they also tried to force the gens de couleur in the colony to take what they called a, quote, oath of respect. which outraged a lot of the gens de couleur and led to some infighting, really, as the gens de couleur continued to describe themselves as discriminated against and kept out of official offices. So there's even some murders and assassinations of some of the white colonial leaders, and some kind of property theft into the summer of 1790. So just a couple months after the white colonists are trying to do all this, there's a quick reaction, especially from the gens de couleur, to try to stop this or to complain about it, even in a kind of illegal ways. So Auger returns to Saint-Domingue, the colony, from France that summer in 1790. And he starts recruiting some of the gens de couleur to basically build a small militia to threaten the white assembly, the white-dominated assembly, and try to demand more power for the gens de couleur in this new colonial government. And of course, the white assembly, they're obsessed with their own power, so they refuse to give in. And in October 1790, Auger leads the gens in a basic revolt against the white colonial leaders. So we have to remember, again, that this is a revolt amongst the gens de couleur themselves. This is not including the slaves throughout the colony. Auger refused to recruit slaves into this army to fight this rebellion. Because, again, the gens de couleur, they're not interested in ending slavery because they own slaves themselves. The gens de couleur, again, are mostly just interested in elevating themselves up to the level of equality with the white colonists. So this is a kind of class-based revolt that Auger leads. The Auger and gens revolt failed by spring of 1791. So Auger himself is arrested and grossly executed publicly. So Auger is killed, and the white colonial leadership survives, and they think they're going to be in charge for the long term. But Auger's kind of brutal and merciless public death was kind of a horrible example of what might happen if you try to rise up against the white colonial elite. But it was also extremely embarrassing to the French government back home in France. So the French government, as a direct result of this, will start offering equality to the small group of the gens de couleur that survived this revolt in May 1791. So Auger is executed, I think it was in April of 1791. And quickly after that, the national government in France is so humiliated by that and so embarrassed by that that they offer some amount of equality for the gens de couleur so that they can be elevated to basically the white level. And of course, the gens de couleur are fairly happy about that. They're going to accomplish their rebellious goal, even though they've lost the rebellion. But that's not the end of any type of rebellion. Other things will also get set off at the same time. And that takes us into the next section. So we're basically going to see the explosion of race wars and anti-slavery wars in the same year, 1791. So the National Assembly in France, its decision to offer some amount of racial equality between whites and the gens de couleur basically sets off a whole bunch of small-scale civil wars in the colony. So, and this is mostly the result of, these instructions come from France that the white colonial leaders have to elevate and recognize the gens de couleur as their equals, basically. But the white colonial elite, they entirely refuse to enforce that law. And the white colonial elite are so upset that the French government has ordered them to do this that they start talking about full-scale secession from France and possibly making Saint-Domingue into an independent country. So that's how offended the white elite are at the general idea of offering any amount of equality or ending discrimination against the gens de couleur. So that shows us how obsessed the white elite are with maintaining power just for themselves in the colony. And once the white elite refused to enforce these national laws coming from France, the gens de couleur start another rebellion, especially in the southern and central parts of the economy, or the southern and central parts of the colony, where they felt that they had the most power because that's where most of the gens de couleur population is. So the white elite will have to fight off a new rebellion among the gens de couleur in the kind of central and southern parts of the colony. At the same time, another bigger revolt starts happening in the northern part of the colony. You can see that's where most of the battles will take place. And this is purely a slave uprising. And that will start in August 1791. And that slave uprising will kill hundreds of white plantation owners in the north, and will burn thousands of plantations all around the north. So this is a whole different conflict that the white elite will have to figure out how to fight this other war at the same time. So we have to remember that this slave uprising in the north had no connection at all to the gens de couleur rebellion in the south. These are two totally different conflicts, and the white elite now find themselves in an impossible position of having to fight both at the same time. And the white elite are very desperate in trying to figure out what are they going to do to actually try to win this stuff. They're so desperate that they start secret negotiations with the British government, which is, their historical enemy because they, recognize themselves as French. So the very fact that they're going to negotiate with the British government to basically invite the British government into the colony, if they're willing to help crush all these black uprisings throughout the colony, the white elite offer the British a deal. If you help us do this and we win, we will turn Saint-Domingue over to the British Empire, so it will become a British colony for the future. So that shows us how desperate they were, the white elite running the colony, because they seemed to realize that they couldn't possibly fight two civil wars at the same time and have any real chance of success. So their greatest goal, the white elite, in the end they start making decisions to protect slavery, to keep slavery going on some level. And they're willing to take pretty extreme steps to accomplish that. So the national government in France hears that eventually they, hear rumors that the white elite in the colony have made that offer to the British, and of course the French government is just outraged at that. So in response, the French government offers full citizenship to all the gens de couleur in April 1792. And that's designed to basically end the gens de couleur rebellion in the south, so that the white colonial elite and the gens de couleur can kind of unify into one government in order to fight off a much more violent slave rebellion going on in the north. And of course the French government also wants to split popular opinion amongst the black rebels between, they want to drive a wedge between the gens de couleur and the slaves in the north. But things are getting pretty out of control in the colony, and the French government eventually send a formal French minister, a functionary, a bureaucrat within the French government, to Saint-Domingue to restore it and maintain order in the colony. So his name is Léger Félicité Santonax. So he arrives in 1793. And he's going to start building an army to try to fight off this slave rebellion in the north. And he offered full-scale freedom to any slave that would join his army in the entire colony. So that got, some people of African descent, some slaves, to join his army, because they figure if they win, they're going to, be freed from their own personal slavery. But of course, that also splits popular opinion amongst the slaves, because the slaves say, well, why don't you join our side and we'll fight off all these French slave owners and we'll kick them out, and then everyone will be free. So Sonthonax has to figure out how is he going to get as much of the black population of the colony on his side. And he eventually takes the even more extreme step of announcing a full-scale end to all slavery in the colony in October 1793. So from that point forward, the colonial government is forced to recognize that there are no slaves anymore in the colony. And again, this is a desperate attempt to convince the slave rebels in the north to stop fighting, that they've accomplished their goal. And the National Assembly in France ratifies this decision in 1794, and then starts making moves to end all slavery in all of the French colonies all over the world. So these attempts, this slave uprising in the northern part of Saint-Domingue has a very large ripple effect throughout the whole world within about a year or two later. So a lot of the French leaders feel basically problem solved, and even the white elite in Saint-Domingue feel that they don't like the end of slavery, but they feel at least the Civil War is going to stop, which was becoming increasingly violent. The problem, though, is that the leader of this slave revolt, named Toussaint Louverture, had been winning in the north. He's been conquering land and destroying plantations and building up his army. So Toussaint Louverture is very adept as a general and a kind of motivator of the slave uprising. And they're winning battles like crazy, and pushing the official French colonial forces out of their area. And Louverture is very famous for taking any resources or any assistance from any power. He doesn't care where it comes from, even Britain or Spain or even the United States, countries that are historically France's enemy, if he thought that their assistance would help the slave uprising win. So Louverture is a very talented politician in general, and he is also willing to go back on those promises and those deals once he feels that the victory is at hand, and he doesn't need that assistance from France's, especially their historical enemies. So to talk about Louverture's army, at least half of his troops were African-born. So they were often captured in Africa and enslaved and brought over to the island to work and live as slaves, probably for the rest of their lives. He often promoted officers within his army from those African ranks, and so former slaves that are fighting for their freedom, if they prove to be talented and brave on the battlefield, he'll promote them and he'll trust them with leadership within the army. And Toussaint Louverture will also promote the gens de couleur that want to join his army and that prove themselves adept and brave on the battlefield and good at leadership. He will promote them also and trust them within his army. And he'll even allow white colonists to join his army if he thinks it's going to help. So he's taking assistance and talent from wherever he can find it, and he's promoting them to be even officers in his army, because he's trying to build up his army as quickly and as powerfully as he possibly can to win this war. The war starts to calm down as Louverture starts making deals with Sonthonax. And Sonthonax recognizes Louverture's power and how much of a following he has. And Sonthonax will name Louverture deputy governor over the colony, which is basically like naming him kind of like vice president under Sonthonax. So that's an attempt to bring Louverture and his forces into the government to stop the fighting. The problem, though, is that Sonthonax also promotes Louverture to be commander-in-chief of the colonial armies in 1797, which basically made him the head general of all the colony's armies. And Louverture used that position to basically arrest Sonthonax on some trumped-up charges and deport him, basically send him back to France, kick him out of the colony. And Louverture at that point named himself really the governor in charge of the whole colony. So Louverture basically runs a coup against Sonthonax, kicks him out, and promotes himself up to the highest level. And Louverture is going to try to run the colony, for himself, and he's going to start, basically making political decisions that will prove popular to some people and unpopular to others. And when Louverture does this, the gens de couleur start a new war against him that Louverture calls the War of the South. So this is a kind of gens de couleur versus Louverture's largely former slave army. So that's the kind of crux of the Civil War that's going to go on here for about a year or so. And at this point, the French government is getting very scared of Louverture because they're afraid of how ambitious he is, and he might try to declare the colonies full independence and break away and become a whole new country under himself. So the French government kind of quietly starts sending supplies and money to the gens de couleur in this conflict. And Louverture himself is that ambitious and that kind of untrustworthy. He even signed secret peace treaties or trade treaties with U.S. and Britain at this time because he realizes that the colony needs trade. It needs imports and exports to keep its economy alive and avoid mass famine, starvation. So Louverture signs these secret deals with the United States and Britain, even though Britain is at war with France at the same time, so he has to do this stuff secretly in order to get away with it, because it would be basically treason for him to negotiate against France's national enemy at the time, since they're still officially a French colony. And Louverture starts doing some other kind of questionable things. Sonthonax had started to rebuild the forced labor system, so they're not going to call it slavery, but it really is forced labor. And Louverture's kind of slant on this, his policy on this, is to basically tell all the former slaves they can either join Louverture's army and fight against the gens de couleur and generally defend the colony's kind of power and independence and to defend the end of slavery. But those former slaves who do not want to join the army will be forced to go back to the plantations and go back to work in usually the sugarcane fields. But it's not full-scale slavery, because he says that you're going to work on the plantations, but you're also going to get paid for it. So you're going to get a share of the profit from those plantations. So he says this is not slavery because you have a choice whether or not to go back and work or join the army, and also you're going to get paid for it, so it's like wage labor. But of course, a lot of the former slaves don't see it that way. They see this as the reemergence of slavery under Louverture, so that really angers them quite deeply. Most of the former slaves, they don't want to go back to work on the plantations. They want to instead become landowners themselves. So they want the power and ability and the opportunity to buy lands and become the overseers instead of the workers. And the only way that Louverture can kind of stop those demands is really to punish them. To tell them again that they have a choice: go into the army or go back to work on the plantations. And he arrests some of the ones who complained and refused, and even executed a bunch of them. So that's how Louverture kind of keeps the economy going, just through what some would call the brutal reinstitution of African slavery. Louverture would justify this as a necessary short-term policy in order to keep the economy going and to drive up the funding and the soldiers to keep the Black Army fighting, and that he says that Black Army is what really guarantees the end of slavery for the long term. It's not laws written on paper. It's having an army big enough to enforce it and to stop any foreign invasion that might try to come in and re-enslave us. Another thing that Louverture will do that is even more unpopular, amazingly, is he and his officers in the army will actually take over many of the landed estates of the white European colonists that they have either killed or arrested or deported out of the colony. And Louverture and his military officers will personally take over a lot of those plantations, and they will take ownership of it and start making themselves into a new kind of black landowning class on the colony. So that angers a lot of gens de couleur, who also feel that they're losing land to Louverture and his forces, his military officers. And a lot of other former slaves are even more angry when Louverture sends messages to a lot of the white colonists who had been landowners, who had fled the colony out of fear for their lives during all these conflicts. He sends messages inviting them back to the colony, and even offers to give them their land back. So that deeply, deeply angers a lot of the former slaves, who say, we want to have a chance to become landowners ourselves, but now you're taking over and giving land to yourself and your allies, and you're offering land to the former slave owners. So they are very, very critical very often of Louverture's leadership. And really the only way that Louverture can stay in office is through building himself up to be a kind of dictator. So Louverture is in office from basically around 1798, 1799 is when he's solidly in power in the colony as its leader, and he starts implementing these policies. The next big section is really related to France again, French politics in France itself. So remember, 1799, the French government's having all kinds of problems, and the French general, Napoleon Bonaparte, thinks that he has a solution to all these problems, so he implements a coup against the French government in December 1799 that really launches him into power and really makes himself into a king without calling himself king. He calls himself, the head consul or something like that. So by early 1800, Napoleon is solidly in power as the unelected leader of France. And he does that by promising that the French Revolution will keep all its accomplishments from the last 10 years, and that he's only going to be in power for a short time, and then he might walk away. So he's very popular in France for doing this. A lot of people see him as the great defender of the revolution at first, for the first few years. And then when he names himself emperor for life over all of the French Empire in, I think it's 1804, that's when his popularity will plummet in France. They'll start to see him more as a dictator than anything else, another tyrant. So Napoleon in 1800, as the new leader of France, he's going to start writing yet another French constitution. So they're on their 6th or 7th constitution under the revolution at this point. So again, Napoleon thinks he has all the solutions for all of France's problems, and he personally sits down with his advisors and his legal scholars and whatnot, and they're going to start writing up a French constitution. The problem, though, is that Napoleon will exclude the colonies in the French Empire from benefiting from a lot of the things that the Constitution will guarantee for the French people in France itself. And that'll anger a lot of the colonists, obviously, because they say that they're just as French as people in France themselves. So a lot of colonies throughout the French Empire will be very angry about Napoleon's early decisions. And Louverture especially, he's going to start ignoring Napoleon's orders and start doing really whatever he wants. And really one of the biggest things that he does is to invade the eastern half of the island, which is still kind of called Saint-Domingue, in January 1801. And he kind of sent messages to Napoleon and the government in Paris alluding to the idea that he might do this. And Napoleon sent back very clear instructions saying, no, you're not allowed to do this. But Louverture did it anyway, which completely angers Napoleon. And Napoleon is one of these types of people that when he gets angry, he starts taking action, and sometimes vicious action. So that's one thing that Louverture did, and basically conquered the whole rest of the island fairly quickly by the spring of 1801. Another thing that Louverture does is he writes his own constitution for Saint-Domingue, in which he declares himself governor general for life. So he's basically setting himself up as the governor of the colony forever, for the rest of his life. And he has that constitution kind of written up and signed off on in May 1801. He also gave himself the power to appoint his successor, so he's kind of heir to this little throne in the island. And this constitution created a legislature for the island. Well, it was a legislature that had very little power, and that he, as the governor, would control for the long term. The constitution, though, did declare everyone living on the island to be French and to be free. So he formally, in the constitution, writes in there that there is no slavery, but there is still this kind of remaining forced labor system that he had created to fight off the gens de couleur in that civil war that had been fought up to 1800. So this is very scary stuff to a lot of international countries who are watching developments in Saint-Domingue and are getting very worried that this slave uprising that has put Louverture in power, and now he's written the Constitution and guaranteeing equality and the end of slavery and whatnot, this all looks like a massive slave uprising that's successful. And that scares a lot of countries throughout the world who still have slavery in their empires. So at the forefront of this is really the United States, who at first had helped Louverture kind of get into power because the United States government thought that promoting Louverture would hurt France's power in the Caribbean. That Louverture might break away and create a newly independent country at some point, and that would damage France. But once Louverture starts really looking like he's going to establish a new country, and this country is going to be solid and in place, especially once President Jefferson comes into office in March of 1801, the U.S. government does pretty much a 180. They do a complete turnaround in their policy. And under President Jefferson, who is always afraid of slave uprisings because he's from the South and he owns plantations, and all of his advisors in his government are big slave owners. So they're all completely paranoid that Louverture and the slave uprisings example in Saint-Domingue will kind of teach slaves throughout the world that they can rise up and do this themselves in their own areas. So the U.S. government is completely paranoid that Louverture's success will inspire slave uprisings in the United States. So President Jefferson starts implementing policies that will stop helping Louverture and will secretly and eventually kind of openly trying to help other countries destroy Louverture's government. And Britain will get involved with that also. Because they also want to guarantee the end of any idea that slave uprisings can be successful around the world. So Jefferson and will lead the United States government into a decision to launch an embargo against the whole island of Saint-Domingue in summer 1801. And an embargo is really the opposite of a boycott. So if a boycott is a refusal to buy things from somebody, an embargo is a refusal to sell things to somebody. So Jefferson pushes the U.S. to pass laws that start an embargo against the island. So it basically makes it illegal for U.S. businesses to export things to the island. And Jefferson and his Republican Party in Congress figure that that will help Napoleon build up an army to go in and reconquer the island and destroy this slave uprising and make it back into a French colony. And other countries will also try to help Napoleon do this, not because they like Napoleon or want to help France in general, but they want to destroy slave uprisings and destroy the possibility of slave uprisings in their own empires. So Spain and the Dutch Empire will get involved in helping Napoleon through one way or the other by giving him money or supplies to build an army to send into Saint-Domingue and basically destroy Louverture's government and possibly reinstitute slavery. So that French army does eventually arrive in February 1802. And it's basically a French invasion of the island. And Louverture has his big army, and they fight it out for a few months. So this is another war on the island between Louverture's largely African army, former slave army, and the French army that's trying to come in to reconquer the island and who knows do what with it after they reconquer it. So the French army eventually wins this war by May of 1802, and the French army largely wins because they promised the black population of the island that the end of slavery would continue under a new French government for the island. So even if the French win, they're not going to bring back slavery. So that convinces a lot of the former slaves they maybe don't want to fight in this, because what are they fighting for? To defend Louverture's government that they don't really like its policies in the first place. So they figure they don't really have a whole lot to lose if the French reconquer the island, because slavery will still be ended. So the French army reconquers the island, defeats Louverture's army, and forces Louverture to sign a peace treaty in May 1802. And quickly after he signed the thing, they then arrest him and deport him to France and keep him in prison in France until he actually died in prison in France a year later in spring 1803. So once Louverture is arrested and deported, he's pretty much out of the picture for the history of the island. So he's taken out. And then, now that the French are solidly back in control of the island, they announce a policy to restart slavery in France's other Caribbean holdings. So not specifically in Saint-Domingue itself, but all of its other Caribbean islands. And that scares a lot of the remaining black leaders throughout the island, saying, uh-oh, we made a bad deal at this point. And any of the black troops who had either sat out the war or might have actually even actively joined the French army in attacking Louverture's army and reconquering the island. At this point, all those former slaves and gens de couleur and anyone else who had joined the French, they all desert the French army because they're afraid that France is now taking the first steps at bringing slavery back to this island too. And so when those black troops leave the French army, they start building up a new revolutionary black army against the French. And they say it's going to be to fight for full-scale independence, to kick the French out for the last time forever, so that the islanders can run the island themselves. And this leads to a war for independence amongst the islanders against the French occupiers. And this war that will go on for a little over a year will become unbelievably brutal. This is going to bring full-scale mass murder to the island on a scale that hasn't been seen yet. You know, the former infighting that's been going on for well over 10 years has killed a lot of people. But this is the one where both sides will basically start to go genocidal against their enemies. So the French army on the island do start going genocidal. They do start wiping out slave populations, the gens de couleur, anyone that they feel is untrustworthy, they will just kill on sight. They will just have executed. So the black forces for themselves, the revolutionary armies, they also become extraordinarily violent. So they start using basically guerrilla warfare, which is really kind of hit and run tactics. They'll hide in the jungles and they'll come out to attack parts of the French army in different places. And when the large French army starts to come to the area to fight a big battle, then the black troops will go back into the forest and go back into hiding. So it's basically kind of hit and run tactics. That's generally what we call guerrilla warfare. And wherever the black troops have control over the island, or parts of the island, whenever the French forces start marching into the area, the black troops will use what historians call a scorched earth policy, which means when the black troops realize that they're losing control over a certain region, they just start massive fires to burn everything down, so that when the French come in to occupy that part of the island, there's no food to eat. There's no places to live. Everything is gone. So the earth is literally scorched. They burn everything down to the dirt, largely to starve the French forces. And the French forces do start suffering because there is famine that starts happening on the island. And we have to remember also this French army is coming from France to the Caribbean, which is often a very difficult thing for a lot of Europeans to do because they're not used to the humidity and the climate, and there's Caribbean diseases, tropical diseases that wipe out a lot of the incoming Europeans. So particularly yellow fever killed off massive numbers of this French army. And of course the black troops will also use atrocities against the white occupiers. Wherever they are able to take over a region, they will just also kind of go genocidal and just kill off the whites, the European colonizers, wherever they find them. So there's atrocities and kind of genocidal, destructive tactics on both sides, and this war becomes unbelievably horrific. And it's kind of a back and forth war for a little while. The tipping point appears to occur in 1803, when Napoleon started another war against Britain in 1803. So that's a whole nother thing that Britain and Napoleon are fighting about that really doesn't have a whole lot to do with Saint-Domingue or the independence movement on the island. But it does impact the island because now Napoleon cannot keep sending more armies into Saint-Domingue to try to reconquer the place. He needs those armies in other places in Europe or other colonies, other parts of the world to fight this new war against Britain. So Napoleon decides to basically pull his armies out of Saint-Domingue and even out of the Louisiana territory at New Orleans because he needs those troops elsewhere. So there's a few different things that kind of happen at the same time in 1803. Napoleon is pulling his troops out. Napoleon also decides, since he doesn't have a lot of troops in Louisiana anymore to defend that area, he might as well sell it to get the money to fight his new war against Britain. So he decides to suddenly sell not just New Orleans, but the whole Louisiana territory, all the way up to Canada, as you see on this map, to the United States. And of course the United States jumps at the deal because they're in it to get as much land as possible. So that becomes known as the Louisiana Purchase in U.S. history. And the United States is now so involved with getting hold of Louisiana that they're going to lift their embargo on Saint-Domingue on the island. And that opens opportunities for the final victories of the black forces on Saint-Domingue to kick out the last of the white European colonizers, and by the end of the year they're going to declare independence under their military general named Jean-Jacques Dessalines. So there's basically a treaty between the black armies on Saint-Domingue and the French invasion force. Treaty happens in late 1803, where basically the French invaders, the colonizers, agree to really get on boats and leave the island. And so General Dessalines proclaims the independence of the at least western part of the island, and he will rename that part Haiti, so it is no longer known as Saint-Domingue, and Haiti is going to be a fully independent country from January 1st, 1804. So that's the major kind of jumping off point for Haiti and the major success of Haitian independence. So the revolution is pretty much over. This is going to be a new country. And of course, it will move to fully end slavery, because it was largely a slave uprising that accomplished all this, and former slave armies that accomplished all this. But the new government, the new country, will immediately have many problems. Number one is that they don't control the whole island. Haiti is only the western part of the island. So Haiti is only the former Saint-Domingue. And Haiti will run into all kinds of problems with its neighbors. Basically, most of the European countries and the United States, they all shun Haiti. They don't want to have relations with Haiti. They don't usually even want to have much trade with Haiti, because they are very afraid, again, that Haiti could be seen as an example for slaves in their own countries, in their own empires, to rise up. Because if the Haitians can accomplish a slave uprising that kicks out the colonizers, ends slavery, and makes this area into a fully independent country run by the former slaves themselves, then they might really try to do that. So a lot of the European powers and the United States are very worried about what some historians call the danger of a good example. So a lot of countries immediately take an anti-Haitian foreign policy. And the United States, especially Southerners in the United States that are obviously the big slave owners, they will do everything they possibly can to not just try to isolate Haiti and harm Haiti, harm its economy, but the Southerners will even try to stop even news reports from coming out of Haiti and getting into the United States. So they're afraid of any ideas about Haiti spreading in the U.S. population, because they're afraid it might start a slave uprising in the United States. But a lot of Northerners in the United States see the value of Haiti, maybe not because of the race wars, but because Haiti still has a lot of these areas that were formerly some of the wealthiest sugar plantations in all the world. So a lot of Northerners in the United States want to start trading with Haiti very quickly, because they see an opportunity to go in and kind of corner a lot of the trade of the sugar coming out of Haiti, and to make a lot of money off of it. So U.S. foreign policy is a little bit split, really, depending on who's in office and where they're from, who's running the government. But for quite a while, it's really going to be kind of Southerners running the government through at least the early 1820s. So the United States will have a very anti-Haiti foreign policy through the 1820s, at least up till the 1820s. France for itself will keep control over Saint-Domingue, the kind of eastern, two-thirds of the island or so. And France will station French troops in Saint-Domingue in the early 1800s, through at least 1809, largely to intimidate Haiti and try to force treaties on Haiti and force certain kind of deals on Haiti that will benefit France. And Dessalines is really the new leader of the Haitian government right off the bat. And Dessalines and the other Haitian leaders are very afraid of any attempt of another European power of invading Haiti and trying to reconquer it and turn it back into a colony. So they're afraid of the British trying this, or even the United States, or even the French trying this again. So Dessalines and his advisors, his government leaders, basically open up a round of massacres of really any whites that are still in Haiti in the spring of 1804. And this is government sanctioned stuff. So again, this is a genocidal type move that Dessalines hoped would accomplish two things at the same time. Number one, it would warn any white European potential colonizers that this will happen to you too if you come into this island and try to conquer it and make it back into a colony. And Dessalines also argued that just killing off all the whites that were left in the island would end any potential long-term feuds or any potential racial conflicts on the island in the future. So if you just wipe out your enemy, you won't have anyone to fight about. So those massacres largely happen in spring of 1804. And it's horrific. But we also have to remember that a lot of those white colonists had held on to slavery in every instance that they found possible at all. And even when they found the odds against them actually winning, they still refused to implement the end of slavery. So these white elites had really done a lot of damage to themselves. A lot of historians argue perhaps if they had been willing to make deals with the gens de couleur or the black revolutionary forces to guarantee an end to slavery, that something like this might not have happened. But again, we don't know that for certain because history didn't unfold that way. But a lot of historians are very, very critical of the white elite who continued trying to hold on to power even as their situation became increasingly desperate and untenable. The next step in the Haitian government's kind of evolution is that Dessalines named himself Emperor of Haiti in October 1804. So he's increasingly moving toward dictatorship powers. He basically names himself Emperor Jacques I for life. His problem, though, is that he politically made decisions that angered a lot of, especially the mulatto part of the population. And they revolted against him just a couple years later in October 1806. So and that kills him. So he's not emperor for very long because of these decisions were so unpopular with some of the factions in the country. And once he is killed in this revolt in 1806, that opens up another big civil war among many different black generals that had factions of the army on their side. And they fight it out for a while, for about really 5 years. And we don't really have the time to get into the details of the ins and outs of that war. But again, it's pretty brutal and pretty horrific. So it's a multifaceted civil war that eventually one guy named Henri Christophe wins as the general of one of the factions. So he wins that civil war in 1811 and then named himself King Henri I. So again, much like Louverture and Dessalines, Christophe moves increasingly toward kind of dictatorship powers to build a new government. He says for stability, but a lot of historians are very critical of him for really just taking power for himself and naming himself king for life, basically. So Henri I's big policies are really to get economic growth going. He, again, much like Louverture, is going to send the former slaves back to the plantations in a forced labor type of scenario, and he says that they're going to be paid, but of course a lot of the former slaves don't like this at all because they see it for what it really is, the reemergence of slavery under their own guy. So this may have stabilized the plantation economy, but caused a lot of hatred against Henri for obvious reasons. These people don't want to be re-enslaved. They want to have a choice where to work or try to buy some land to become landowners themselves. And Henri I will, do a lot of different things that are very controversial amongst the general population of the island. He starts building some palaces that are pretty expensive and opulent. He builds some fortresses, he says, to defend the island, but again, seem to be really kind of enriching his own advisors and even his own family members. So eventually in 1820 there's a coup against him amongst even his closest soldiers and his closest generals get together because they don't like his leadership. They say he's basically mismanaging the country. And instead of fighting it out, Henri chooses suicide. So he kills himself in 1820, and that'll bring a new government into office. But the kind of trend of generals getting into office and then declaring themselves king becomes a kind of major historical and predictable facet of the Haitian government into the far-term future. And Haiti continues running into problems even after Henri is gone in the 1820s. Haiti, again, is just the western half of the island, or the western third of the island. And a lot of other countries don't even recognize Haiti's independence. Like France itself doesn't even recognize Haiti as a full-fledged independent country until 1825. And that's even at the cost of Haiti has to agree to a gigantic debt, 100 million francs, or $100 million in what France calls reparations for all the damage done to these French families who lost their plantations and were often murdered. So the French government says, we'll give you full-scale government recognition of your independence if you agree to pay off this $100 million debt, basically. And the Haitian government is fairly desperate at that point, so they agree to it. And they'll track that debt into the 1880s. So this is like a 60-year term on a loan that they're going to have to pay back. And it's not even a loan. They don't even get the money up front. It's just a kind of like a fine for all the damage that the Haitian Revolution did to the French people. Britain itself won't even start to trade with Haiti until the 1840s. So Britain runs its own embargo against Haiti for decades, for another 20 some odd years, largely for the reasons we've already talked about. The United States will start embargoes and keep embargoes until about 1810, and then end the embargo. So the embargo from the United States, making it illegal for American ships to go to Haiti, that comes and goes for from about 1806 to 1810. But the United States won't even recognize Haiti as a formal, fully independent country until the 1860s. So now we're talking about 4 decades after really where we're going to end this lecture. So Haiti has a lot of problems on the international scene, economically and politically. And why does the United States eventually agree to recognize Haiti in the 1860s? It's because the United States fights its own civil war and ends slavery in the United States in the 1860s. So that's when they feel, obligated, basically, to recognize Haiti as an independent country. So now we'll talk about the kind of major long-term results of the Haitian Revolution, because it is one of the giant revolutions in all of human history, even though it's not often discussed, especially in European or United States history classes. But the Haitian Revolution is major because it's the first ever, and even to this day, it's the biggest slave revolt in all of world history that built a newly independent country run by the former slaves themselves. So this is a giant kind of motivation to a lot of other slaves in other parts of the world to try to do the same thing. To them, it's a really good example that they can accomplish this too. It may be very bloody and it may take 15, 20 years to get it done. But again, it is possible. So the Europeans hate this, and a lot of the other enslaved and oppressed people throughout the world will often look to Haiti and its revolution as an example, as motivation, and often as an example of what not to do with your government, building dictatorships or something for the long-term future. And again, we have to remember that at least a third of the population of Haiti, before all these revolts even started in 1789, a third of the population is killed during all this or fled the island over the next 15, 16 years. By the time the fighting really dies down in 1805. So that's a massive depopulation of the island. And it's almost entirely the white Europeans. They're pretty much wiped out off the island either by being killed or willingly leaving out of fear of being killed. So that's a massive amount of violence and massive social upheaval for really any society, a third of their population. And we should also remember that it's early revolutionary leaders like Louverture, Dessalines, and Christophe. They all transition toward dictatorial powers. Even as they talk about writing a constitution and freedom and equality and whatnot, they tend to kind of trend toward dictatorship throughout their lives. And they say that they need those kind of dictatorship powers. They need to be the strongman running the government in order to stop slavery from coming back to the island. So they say they need that level of power to stop foreign countries from invading Haiti and making it back into a colony and possibly bringing slavery back, re-enslaving all of the people of the island. But historians are often very critical of that. Was it really necessary to create a dictatorship or an empire in Haiti, an imperial government, to stop that? We don't know for sure. But historians are very critical of that argument, that there might have been other avenues or other types of governments they could have built that could have gotten the same result of keeping slavery in the past. We also have to remember that the Haitian Revolution is largely a race-based revolution. It's an anti-slavery revolution run by the slaves themselves to end slavery and get an independent country. And because of that, a lot of nationalism ideas in Haiti are very much tied to race. This was an uprising of slaves, an uprising of people of African descent to overthrow and get rid of the white elite and their government. And the Haitian government for many, many years will make it illegal for any white people to own land. So they're very, very worried about the ability of non-Africans to buy land and get rich in Haiti. Because if they get rich, they might be able to build up enough power to overthrow the government and bring slavery back. And again, when we study the civil war that was fought to build Haiti, and the Revolutionary War especially, all sides used any resources they could possibly find in order to win the Civil War for themselves. So going all the way back to the start of the Civil War, the white elites who were running the colony, who started the rebellions, they wanted to keep slavery above all else. And they're willing to make deals with even the British government to come in and crush the black uprisings to guarantee slavery, even if they're going to become a British colony after it all. And on their side, on the other side, the black armies, their big goal is to end slavery, and they're willing to do virtually anything they possibly can to guarantee that and make deals with any foreign power that they can. So they will offer to stay a French colony and make deals with the French government to keep the end of slavery. They will make deals with foreign governments like the United States to bring money or supplies in to fight off Napoleon or some other French invasion of the island. And in the end, they seem to view full-scale political independence, having their own country, as the best guarantee of never having slavery come back. And eventually Haiti, even in the 18 teens, even as a fairly young country, only 10 years old or so, they're going to get involved in other anti-slavery movements in Latin America. So we'll talk about that in a few lectures, especially related to Simón Bolívar and the revolutions in Venezuela and South America. So Haiti will get actively involved in that and will send resources to Bolivar as long as Bolivar promises to end slavery in any places that he is able to drive toward independence. And again, in the long term, all foreign powers are hostile toward Haiti because Haiti is a country run by former slaves who rose up against Europeans and massacred them in the end to guarantee that people of African descent would run the government and that they would never have slavery again. So Haiti faces many, many hostile foreign powers, and virtually all the most powerful countries in the world take an anti-Haitian stance and try to harm Haiti's economy or boycott them or do something or other to try to intimidate Haiti. But Haiti survives as an independent government for the long term and is still in existence today. So we'll stop here, and next time we'll get into really more with Napoleon and what he starts doing in relationship with Spain that pushes more revolutions to start to develop throughout the rest of Latin America. So that's where we're really going for the rest of this module.